As cartography spread globally, it standardized the way humanity saw the planet. Different cultures were forced into a single visual language that privileged straight lines, fixed points, and permanent borders. Local place names were replaced with official ones. Sacred landscapes were relabeled as landmarks. What could not be translated into cartographic symbols was often lost. This was not done through violence alone, but through normalization. The map quietly told everyone what mattered. Yet the cartographer's paradox does not end with domination. It also reveals something deeply human, our desire to understand, to organize, to make sense of complexity. Maps exist because uncertainty is uncomfortable. They promise clarity in a chaotic world. But clarity always comes at a cost. Every map is a selection. Every selection is a value judgment, and every value judgment shapes reality. In recent decades, this paradox has begun to surface more openly. Scholars, indigenous communities, and environmental thinkers have started questioning the authority of traditional maps. New forms of mapping have emerged, ones that include oral histories, emotional geographies, cultural memory, and ecological relationships. These maps do not claim to be final or objective. They accept change. They acknowledge perspective. They admit that no single view can capture the whole truth of a place. Digital technology has amplified both sides of the paradox. Satellite imagery gives the illusion of total knowledge, yet algorithms still decide what is visible and what is ignored. Data layers replace hand-drawn lines, but the power dynamics remain. What gets mapped gets managed, what gets managed gets prioritized, and what is left out continues to fade. The deeper truth is that maps have always been stories, stories told from a particular height, a particular moment, a particular worldview. The danger was never in mapping itself, but in forgetting that maps are human creations, not mirrors of reality. The moment we stopped questioning them, we allowed them to define not just the Earth, but ourselves. The cartographer's paradox asks us to sit with an uncomfortable realization that our greatest tools for understanding the world may also be the tools that distance us from it. By trying to define everything, we risk losing the richness of what cannot be easily defined. By drawing borders, we forget the flows that sustain life. By insisting on precision, we erase ambiguity, and with it, empathy. In the end, the story of mapping is not a tale of discovery, but of transformation. The world did not change because it was mapped. It changed because we began to believe the map was the world. And until we learn to see maps not as answers, but as questions, the paradox will continue, quietly shaping our planet, one line at a time. Long before maps were folded into pockets or hung on classroom walls, the world was understood through movement, memory, and meaning. For countless generations, human beings navigated their surroundings without ever needing to freeze them on paper. Rivers were known by how they sounded at night. Mountains were remembered by the way clouds gathered around their peaks. Paths were not straight lines, but lived experiences, shaped by seasons, stories, and survival. Geography was relational, not fixed. The land was not something you stood apart from and measured. It was something you belonged to. When European-style cartography emerged as a dominant force, it brought with it a radically different philosophy. The land was no longer something to live within, but something to be observed from above, abstracted, reduced, and standardized. A map promised certainty. It offered control. And, most dangerously, it suggested objectivity. Lines drawn with rulers and ink appeared neutral, scientific, and indisputable. But beneath that appearance lay assumptions that would ripple across the planet. Early modern cartographers believed that to know something truly, it had to be defined. Coastlines were traced, rivers named, and territories boxed into recognizable shapes. Anything that resisted definition,
Seasonal settlements, shifting boundaries, oral histories was treated as chaos, not knowledge. When maps labeled regions as unknown or unexplored, they were not describing reality, they were revealing the limits of their own worldview. Those lands were unknown only to the people drawing the maps. As mapping techniques improved, so did their authority. A place that appeared on a map suddenly felt real in a way that unnamed places did not. To be mapped was to exist in the global imagination. To be unmapped was to be ignored, dismissed, or overwritten. This created a quiet hierarchy of spaces, where some regions were seen as central to history and others as peripheral, regardless of how many lives had unfolded there for centuries. The paradox deepened as maps began influencing decisions rather than reflecting them. Trade routes were planned according to drawn lines instead of lived experience. Cities were founded where maps suggested rivers should be useful, not where ecosystems naturally supported life. Borders were imagined first on paper and only later enforced on the ground. In this way, maps stopped being descriptive tools and became prescriptive forces. They didn't just show the world, they instructed it on what it was supposed to be. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the way land ownership was conceptualized. For much of human history, land was understood as a shared system of responsibilities rather than a possession. Mapping changed that. Once land could be measured, numbered, and recorded, it could be bought, sold, taxed, and inherited. A drawn boundary transformed soil into property. This shift did not simply reorganize economies, it redefined relationships between humans and the earth itself. Nature, too, was reshaped by cartographic thinking. Forests became resources instead of habitats. Rivers became transportation corridors instead of living systems. Wetlands, difficult to define and inconvenient to measure, often disappeared entirely from maps and soon after from reality. If something could not be easily represented, it was treated as expendable. The act of simplification carried real ecological consequences. Even time was affected. Traditional knowledge systems often viewed time as cyclical, tied to seasons, migrations, and recurring natural patterns. Maps, however, encouraged a linear view of progress. Expansion moved forward, borders advanced, blank spaces were filled in. History became a story of constant outward motion, with little room for balance, pause, or return. The future was always somewhere else on the map.